Black Hollow was never a peaceful place. It was a settlement carved out of the wild, where men had to fight for every inch of land. But now, something worse than hunger or winter haunted them. Nathaniel Graves had been away for years, fighting in wars and chasing fortune in lands far beyond these woods. But when he returned, he found his hometown frozen in fear. It started with missing cattle, nothing unusual for a land ruled by wolves. Then it was horses, dogs, and sheep. Soon after, it was people. The first to disappear was a boy named Caleb Barnes. He had gone into the woods one evening and never came back. His father and older brother went searching for him. Neither of them returned. Then came the hunter, Jedediah Finch, a man who had tracked grizzlies across mountains and felled elk with a single shot. He boasted that he'd find whatever was lurking in the dark. 3 days later, his rifle was found snapped in half, and his blood was smeared across the trees like war paint. The people of Black Hollow whispered in fear. Some said it was a demon, some said it was a punishment from God, but the oldest among them knew the name for it, Shadowfang. Nathaniel walked into the Rusty Stag, the town's only tavern, to find the place dead silent. Normally, the air would be thick with pipe smoke, the sound of dice rolling on wooden tables, and the laughter of drunken men. Not tonight. Tonight, fear sat in every corner, like a shadow nobody wanted to speak of. A few men were huddled near the fireplace. Their voices were low, but urgent. Silas Boone, an old friend of Nathaniel's, saw him enter and stood up. "Nate, you're back," Silas said, shaking his head with a grim expression. "Seems like I picked the wrong time to come home," Nathaniel muttered. He pulled off his hat, shook the snow off, and took a seat. "Tell me, what's going on?" Before Silas could answer, the tavern door swung open with a loud bang. A man stumbled in. His face was pale as a corpse, and his hands were shaking violently. His clothes were torn, and he stank of sweat and blood. It was old Tom, the town's best trapper. He opened his mouth to speak, but all that came out was a dry rasp. "Tom?" Silas rushed to him. "What happened? Where's Elijah?" Old Tom's lips trembled. He tried to speak again, but his voice cracked. Then he collapsed. It took a full bottle of whiskey to steady old Tom's hands, and even then his eyes were still wild with terror. "We went tracking. Up near Hollow Creek," he began. "Me and Elijah were looking for the thing that's been killing the livestock. Thought maybe it was a big wolf, maybe a rogue bear. We set traps. Good ones." He swallowed hard. "And then, just before dusk, we found tracks." Nathaniel leaned forward. "What kind of tracks?" Old Tom's fingers clenched the table. "Bear tracks, but too big, far too big. And the claws, they left gashes in the earth like a reaper's blade. I tell ya, I ain't never seen nothing like it." Silas glanced at Nathaniel, concern flashing in his eyes. They had hunted bears before, big ones, dangerous ones, but what Tom was describing wasn't normal. "We followed the trail," Tom continued. "It led to a clearing, real quiet. The kind of quiet that don't belong in the woods." His breath hitched, and there he was. A silence fell over the room. "Who?" Nathaniel asked. Tom's eyes flickered up, filled with something beyond fear. "The devil himself. We didn't hear him coming. One moment, we were standing there. Next moment, Elijah screamed. I turned, and, God have mercy, he was already dead." Nathaniel's fingers tightened around his mug. "You saw it?" Tom nodded. His entire body shook. "It wasn't a bear," he whispered. "Not like any bear God put on this earth." He raised a trembling hand and drew a shape in the spilled whiskey on the table. A paw print, wider than any man's chest, with 5 long hooked claws. The beast stood on its hind legs, tall as 2 men. Its fur was blacker than night. Its eyes burned red, like hot coals. "I shot it, point blank." His voice broke. It didn't even flinch. The room was deadly silent. Nathaniel finally spoke. "How did you escape?" Tom swallowed. I ran like a coward." Nobody blamed him. Nathaniel stood, pushing back his chair. "This thing is hunting us. That means we hunt it first." Silas nodded. "We'll need a party. The best hunters. The best weapons." Tom shook his head violently. "You don't understand," he rasped. "Bullets don't work. I shot it. It didn't bleed." Silas frowned. "Then how do we kill it?" Tom looked at the fire, his face hollow. "You don't," he said. A shiver ran through the room. That night, a scream tore through Black Hollow. Nathaniel and Silas rushed outside, muskets in hand. The snow was painted red. A man lay in the middle of the street, torn open like a sack of grain. His face was frozen in terror, his eyes wide and glassy. His heart was missing. A set of massive footprints led away from the body, vanishing into the trees. The morning came with a heavy silence. No birds, no wind, just the cold weight of fear hanging over Black Hollow. The body from last night was already buried, but the blood on the snow had not yet faded. Nathaniel stood at the edge of town, looking into the dark forest. Somewhere in there, the beast was waiting. "We go tonight," Nathaniel said, his voice firm. Silas Boone nodded. He was a man of few words, but his sharp gray eyes had the look of a man who had seen death and walked away from it. "I'll bring my rifle and silver bullets," he said. Father Calloway, the town's priest, crossed his arms. "You believe that will work?" Silas shrugged. "I believe in being ready for anything." Others joined in, strong men, hunters, and trappers. Elias Carter, a burly blacksmith with arms like iron, brought his axe. Micah Tanner, the fastest tracker in town, packed his knives. Father Calloway carried a wooden cross and a flask of holy water. "This thing is not just an animal," he warned. "There is evil at work here." Nathaniel tightened his coat. "Then we take evil head on." That night they set out into the forest. 10 men, armed and ready. They didn't know only a few would return. The trees swallowed them whole. The deeper they went, the colder it got. The air was thick, heavy, like walking through a graveyard where the dead still whispered. Micah found the first sign. "Tracks," he said, kneeling down. "Fresh." Nathaniel looked. Massive paw prints, too large, too deep. "This thing's close," Micah whispered. They pressed on, muskets ready. Then came the stench. A thick, rotting smell filled the air, making the men gag. Elias covered his nose. "God Almighty," he cursed. "What is that?" Father Calloway closed his eyes. Death. Then they saw it. A deer, or what was left of it. The poor creature had been torn in half, its ribs cracked open, its insides spilled onto the snow. But that wasn't the worst part. The meat hadn't been eaten. This wasn't hunger. This was killing for the sake of killing. Silas cursed under his breath. "This thing ain't normal." Nathaniel knelt beside the carcass. The wounds were fresh. He touched the blood. Still warm. He stood up, his face grim. "It's here," he said, "watching us." A branch snapped behind them. The men turned, muskets raised. Nothing. Silence. Then, a low growl. The sound crawled up their spines. Deep, rumbling, unnatural. "Steady," Nathaniel whispered. Then it moved. A black shadow, fast as lightning, crashing through the trees. Silas fired first. Bang! A second shot. Bang! Something screeched, not like a bear, not like anything human. Then it was on them. Claws, fury. Micah screamed as the beast ripped him from the ground. Blood sprayed across the snow. Elias swung his axe. It barely scratched the thing. Nathaniel fired his musket. The shot hit, but the beast didn't fall. Silas reloaded, fast as he could. "It's not dying," he shouted. The men ran. The beast chased. Father Calloway threw holy water. It hissed on the beast's black fur like fire. The monster howled, stumbling back. It gave them just enough time to escape. Nathaniel and Silas crashed through the trees, breathing hard, hearts pounding. Elias was beside them, covered in blood. "Micah's gone," he gasped. They didn't stop running until they reached Hollow Creek, the frozen river at the forest's edge. The monster didn't follow. Nathaniel turned back, his face pale. "It let us go." Silas wiped the sweat from his face. "What do you mean?" Nathaniel stared into the dark trees. "It could have killed all of us, but it didn't." A terrible thought crept into his mind. "It's playing with us." When they returned to town, they were fewer in number. Old Tom was waiting for them at the tavern. When he saw the blood on their clothes, the missing men, he just shook his head. "You see now," he whispered. "It can't be killed." Nathaniel didn't answer. His hand still shook from what he had seen. Shadowfang was no ordinary bear. It was something else, something worse, and it was still out there, watching, waiting. The night after the failed hunt was the longest night Black Hollow had ever known. The town had lost good men. Micah Tanner was gone. 2 others had vanished in the fight, and those who returned, they weren't the same. Nathaniel sat in the rusty stag, staring at his untouched drink. His hands were still stained with Micah's blood. His heart was heavy. Silas sat across from him, staring at the flames in the fireplace. "That thing ain't just a bear," he muttered. "It ain't just an animal." Nathaniel nodded. "I know." Father Calloway tightened his grip on his wooden cross. "Then we must stop thinking like Hunter," he said, "and start thinking like men at war. A war against something that should not exist." The tavern door creaked open. A woman stepped in, her face pale, her eyes filled with silent terror. It was Mary Barnes, the mother of Caleb, the boy who disappeared weeks ago. She walked straight to Nathaniel and fell to her knees. "You have to help me," she whispered. "You have to bring my son back." Silas looked down, unable to meet her eyes. Mary grabbed Nathaniel's arm, her fingers cold as ice. "I know he's alive," she whispered. "I know it." Nathaniel took a deep breath. How could he tell her the truth? The boy was gone, but something inside him, something stubborn, something desperate, made him nod. "I'll find out what happened," he promised. Mary's eyes filled with tears. "Bless you, Nathaniel. Bless you." That night, Father Calloway pulled out an old, dust-covered book from the church. It smelled of age and fear. "This isn't just a beast," he said. "It's something far worse." Nathaniel and Silas leaned in as he flipped through the pages. Then he stopped. His fingers hovered over an old drawing, a monstrous creature, standing on two legs, with red eyes and sharp claws. The name below it sent a chill through Nathaniel's bones. Wendigo. Silas exhaled sharply. "Hell," he muttered. Father Calloway read in a low voice. "A spirit of hunger. A man who eats flesh and is cursed to become a beast. Never full, never satisfied, only knowing one thing, the hunger to kill." Nathaniel felt something cold settle in his chest. "You think that's what we're hunting?" Father Calloway nodded. "The signs match. The size, the speed, the way it doesn't eat its victims. Just kills for the sake of killing. The legends say, once a man turns into a Wendigo, he can never die. Not by normal means." Silas let out a slow breath. "Then how do we kill it?" Father Calloway turned the page. There, written in faded ink, were the words, "The heart must be burned." Nathaniel looked up. "Burn the heart." Calloway nodded. "Cut it out. Burn it to ash. That is the only way." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He thought about Micah, about the men who had died. It had to end. And if there was one man who might know how to kill a monster like this, it was Mad Elias. Nathaniel stood, his voice firm. "We go to Elias. He's the only one who's faced this thing and lived." Silas frowned. "That old hermit? He's half mad." "Maybe," Nathaniel said. "But if anyone knows how to kill Shadowfang, it's him." Father Calloway crossed himself. "Then we go at first light, and we pray it's enough." The journey to Mad Elias's cabin was a descent into madness. The forest grew darker the deeper they went, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes. The air was cold and heavy, carrying the faint stench of rot. Nathaniel led the way, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. Silas followed, close behind, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Father Calloway brought up the rear, clutching his cross and muttering prayers under his breath. Finally, they found the cabin, a rotting shack barely standing, with strange symbols carved into the wood. The door creaked open before they could knock. A figure stood in the doorway, tall, thin, and wrapped in filthy furs. His beard was wild, his eyes sunken, but the moment Nathaniel saw them, he knew. This man had seen something that broke him. "You shouldn't have come," Elias rasped, his voice dry and cracked like dead leaves underfoot. Nathaniel stepped forward. "We're hunting Shadowfang." Elias laughed, a sound so hollow, so dead, that even Silas flinched. "You think you can hunt it? You think you can kill it?" Nathaniel narrowed his eyes. "We don't think. We know." Elias shook his head. "Then you are already dead." Inside, the air smelled of burnt herbs and old blood. Animal skulls hung from the ceiling, and strange markings covered the walls, drawn in something dark and dried. Father Calloway swallowed hard. "This is unholy." Elias sat by the fire, poking at the embers with a long knife. He stared into the flames as he spoke. "You've heard the stories, haven't you? A beast, a monster, A bear bigger than any man? Nathaniel nodded. Aye, and we've seen it. Elias chuckled darkly. It was never just a bear. Silas crossed his arms. Then what is it? Elias leaned forward, his eyes glinting. It was a man. Once. A cold silence filled the room. A frontiersman named Edgar Dane, Elias continued. Long before Black Hollow was built, he and his men got caught in the mountain. The snow came early that year. The food ran out. Nathaniel's stomach twisted. He already knew what was coming. They turned on each other, Elias whispered. One by one, they fell, and the ones who remained, he licked his lips. They ate. Father Calloway crossed himself. But Dane, he ate the most. And when the storm finally passed, he walked out of those mountains different, changed. Elias's voice dropped lower. He was cursed. The hunger never left him. It only grew. Silas exhaled slowly. You're saying that thing out there used to be a man? Elias nodded. And he's been hunting ever since. 200 years of blood. 200 years of hunger. Nathaniel clenched his fists. Then we put him down. Elias's eyes locked onto his. You can't. You shot it, didn't you? Elias asked. Nathaniel nodded. Right in the head. And what happened? Nathaniel hesitated. It didn't die. Elias gave him a dead man's smile. That's because it can't. Silas scoffed. Everything dies. Elias shook his head. Not Shadowfang. Not in any way you'd understand. He pointed to the fire. A bullet won't kill it. A blade won't kill it. It doesn't live like we do, so it doesn't die like we do. Father Calloway's voice was a whisper. Then how do we stop it? Elias let out a slow breath. Then he picked up his knife and stabbed it into the wooden table. You burn the heart. Silas frowned. Burn it? Elias nodded. Cut it out. Set it to flame. Turn it to ash. That is the only way to end the curse. Nathaniel took a slow breath. And how do we get close enough to do that? Elias looked at him. You don't. Silence. Then Nathaniel stood. Then we make it happen. Elias rose from his chair and walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. He opened it and pulled out an old, blackened knife. The blade was stained with something dark, something that didn't look like rust. This blade has killed one before, Elias said, handing it to Nathaniel. It can do it again. Nathaniel took the knife. It felt heavy in his hands. Silas crossed his arms. So what's the plan? Nathaniel looked at him, his eyes cold, his voice steady. We go back into that forest. He glanced at the priest. We bless our bullets. Then, gripping the knife, he whispered, and we cut that monster open. That night, they returned to Black Hollow, armed with new knowledge, new weapons. The town was still afraid, but now there was hope. Because this time, they weren't just hunting a beast. They were hunting a legend. And this time, they would not run. The hunt was on. The forest was silent. No wind, no birds. Just the heavy breathing of men who knew they were walking into the mouth of death. Nathaniel Graves led the way, his musket slung over his back, his hand resting on the blackened knife Elias had given him. Every step felt like it carried weight. This wasn't just another hunt. This was their last chance. They had chosen the old clearing by Hollow Creek, the place where the beast had slaughtered their men. The plan was simple. A deep pit, lined with sharpened silver spikes. A large deadfall trap, a massive log rigged to swing down, a small fire to lure it in, and the most dangerous part, bait. They tied a young lamb to a stake in the middle of the clearing. The animal bleated softly, tugging at the rope. It had no idea what waited in the shadows. Neither did they. The hunters took their positions. Nathaniel and Silas crouched behind a fallen log, muskets ready. Elias stood near the deadfall, his axe in his hands. Father Calloway clutched his wooden cross, whispering a prayer. The fire crackled. Shadows danced against the trees. Then the wind changed. The smell hit them first. A deep, rotting stench, like blood left too long in the sun. Nathaniel's stomach clenched. It was here. A branch snapped in the distance. The lamb froze, its ears twitching. Then the growl, guttural, not of this world. Nathaniel tightened his grip on his knife. Come on, you bastard. Then out of the shadows it moved. At first, it was just a shape, a towering shadow slipping between the trees. Then, the firelight caught it. The monster stepped into the clearing, and it was worse than Nathaniel remembered. Massive. Standing on two legs, its black fur matted with dried blood, red eyes burning like hellfire, claws as long as daggers. But the worst part was its face. Not a bear, not an animal, something wrong, twisted, hungry. It stared at the lamb, then it lifted its head and looked straight at Nathaniel. He barely had time to whisper, "Now!" Silas fired first. Bang! The silver bullet slammed into the beast's shoulder. It snarled but didn't fall. Nathaniel fired next. Bang! This time, the shot staggered it. Elias pulled the rope. The deadfall log swung down, crashing into the beast's side with a sickening crunch. It roared, stumbling backward, straight into the pit. Thud. Silence. Nathaniel dared to breathe. He stepped forward, peering over the edge. The beast lay impaled on the silver spikes, not moving. Father Calloway whispered, "Is it dead?" Nathaniel pulled the knife from his belt. Not yet. He jumped into the pit. The spikes had pierced the beast's limbs, pinning it in place. Its chest rose and fell, slow but steady. Nathaniel raised the knife, and that's when its eyes snapped open. Faster than any man could move, its claws lashed out. Nathaniel barely managed to jump back as one of the spikes snapped like a twig. Silas shouted, "Nate, move!" The beast tore itself free. Blood poured from its wounds, but it didn't care. It was angry now. Nathaniel scrambled out of the pit, just as Shadowfang lunged. The trap had failed, and now the monster was hunting them. The hunters ran. The beast crashed through the trees behind them, a force of nature, a storm of claws and rage. Silas fired over his shoulder. Bang! The bullet hit, but the monster didn't slow. Nathaniel grabbed Father Calloway, pulling him forward. "Run!" Elias turned, swinging his axe. The beast caught it midair and ripped it from his hands. "Go!" Elias shouted. "I'll hold it off." Nathaniel hesitated. Elias met his eyes. "Get to the church." Then, with nothing but his fists, Elias charged. Nathaniel didn't look back. He heard the roar, heard Elias scream. Then, silence. He wanted to turn around, wanted to fight, but he knew the truth. Elias was gone, and if they didn't move, they would be too. They reached Black Hollow's church, slamming the doors shut. Father Calloway locked them in. Nathaniel fell to his knees, panting. Silas leaned against the wall, his hands shaking. Outside, in the darkness, the beast growled. It hadn't left. It was waiting, watching, and now, Nathaniel knew. It was smarter than they thought. It was learning, and it wasn't done with them yet. The night sky was a deep shade of red. Nathaniel Graves had seen many strange things in his life. Wars, death, monsters lurking in the dark. But tonight, under the glow of the blood moon, he realized something terrifying. Shadowfang was not just a cursed man. It was something far worse, and if they didn't stop it now, nothing ever would. They gathered the last of the hunters. Silas, Father Calloway, a few other men who hadn't fled yet. "This is it," Nathaniel said. "We finish it tonight." Nobody spoke, because they knew not all of them would come back. "We burn the forest," Silas said flatly. Nathaniel nodded. "We trap it inside, force it into one last fight." Father Calloway held his cross tightly. "This land is already cursed. A little fire won't make it worse." Nathaniel looked at the sky. The red moon glowed down on them, staining the snow like fresh blood. "It's waiting for us," he said. "Let's not make it wait too long." They moved fast, torches in hand, muskets loaded. Oil splashed against the trunks of trees. Nathaniel worked quickly, his heart pounding. They had to move before the beast realized what they were doing. Then, in the distance, a sound, a deep, guttural snarl. Nathaniel looked up. Glowing red eyes stared back at him from the treetops. Shadowfang was already here, and it was watching them burn its home. "Light it!" Nathaniel roared. The torches dropped. Flames exploded through the forest. The fire raced up the trees, spreading fast, filling the air with black smoke. The forest burned, and deep within the flames, the beast howled. It was trapped. There was no escape now. Nathaniel tightened his grip on the knife Elias had given him. This was it, the last fight. Through the fire and smoke, a shadow moved. Then, From the flames, it stepped forward. Shadowfang. Burning embers clung to its black fur. Its red eyes glowed like molten fire. It did not look like a bear anymore. It did not look like a man. It looked like something ancient, something older than the forest itself. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and then it spoke, not in words, not in a language they could understand, but in a voice that filled their heads, that rattled in their bones, a voice of hunger, a voice of death. And then it charged. Silas fired first. Boom! The bullet slammed into Shadowfang's chest. It didn't stop. Nathaniel pulled his musket up, fired point blank. Boom! The shot hit the beast's shoulder. Bone shattered. Still, it kept coming. The fire roared around them, closing in, trapping them all inside. Silas reloaded. We can't hold it back, Nathaniel knew. This wasn't about stopping it. This was about getting close enough. He gripped the blackened knife. One shot. One chance. The heart. That was the only way. Burn the heart. Nathaniel charged forward. The beast swiped. Nathaniel ducked, rolling beneath its claws. It roared. A deafening, unnatural sound. Silas fired again. The bullet tore through its leg, forcing it to stumble. Nathaniel saw his chance. He leapt. The knife sank into the beast's chest. Shadowfang screamed. Nathaniel held on tight, driving the blade deeper into the monster's flesh. Its claws raked across his back. Pain exploded through him. The beast thrashed, trying to shake him loose, but Nathaniel didn't let go. He reached into the wound, his fingers wrapped around something solid, the heart. It was still beating, still alive. Burn it! Nathaniel screamed. Silas grabbed a torch and threw it. The flame hit the beast's chest. The heart caught fire. Shadowfang let out a howl that shattered the night. It stumbled, fell, burned, and then, at last, it stopped moving. Nathaniel rolled onto his back, gasping for breath. The forest burned around them. The sky was still red, but the monster was gone. Silas limped over, coughing from the smoke. Is it dead? Nathaniel forced himself to sit up. The blackened corpse of Shadowfang lay in the dirt, its chest a smoldering ruin. It did not move. It did not breathe. Nathaniel closed his eyes. It was over. The hunt was over. They returned to Black Hollow at dawn. The people came out of their homes, staring in disbelief. The monster that had haunted them for generations was no more. But Nathaniel knew something deep in his bones. Evil never truly dies. It only sleeps. And somewhere, in another forest, on another night, something else would wake. But for now, Shadowfang was dead, and the people of Black Hollow were free. For the first time in a long, long time, the night was silent. The days after Shadowfang's death were quiet. Too quiet. For the first time in months, no bodies were found in the snow. No screams echoed in the night. No blood stained the town's doorstep. The people of Black Hollow began to step outside again. The fear that had held them prisoner for so long, it was fading. And yet, Nathaniel Graves couldn't rest, because something didn't feel right. The first dream came a week later. Nathaniel was standing in the woods, the trees stretching tall around him. The air was still, too still. Then he heard it, a growl, low, deep, ancient, and from the darkness 2 red eyes stared back at him, the beast, alive, waiting. Then he woke up, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, his fingers still gripping for a musket that wasn't there. He told himself it was just a dream, that the monster was dead, that the hunt was over. But deep down, he knew better. The first real sign came days later. Nathaniel was out near Hollow Creek, helping clear the remains of the burned forest. That's when he saw them. Tracks. Large. Too large. Leading from the ashes, but not away. Back into the woods. His blood ran cold. It wasn't possible. It had to be his mind playing tricks on him. Had to be his fear twisting the truth. But then, a howl echoed from deep in the trees, and every hair on his body stood on end. Nathaniel rushed back to Black Hollow, straight to the Rusty Stag. Silas was there, drinking, looking better than he had in weeks. Nathaniel slammed his hands on the table. We need to talk. Silas frowned. What now? Nathaniel hesitated. How could he explain what he saw? How could he tell a man who risked his life that maybe, Just maybe. None of it mattered. Tracks, Nathaniel finally said. I found tracks. Silas set his drink down slowly. What kind of tracks? You already know, Nathaniel whispered. Silas didn't speak, because he did know, and the look in Nathaniel's eyes told him everything he needed to hear. That night, they gathered the last of the hunters, the ones who had fought, the ones who had seen. Father Calloway was there. His hands were steady now, but his eyes held a haunted look. They all sat around the fire, the flames casting long shadows against the wooden walls. No one spoke at first. Then Silas cleared his throat. Nathaniel found tracks. The room fell silent. Then Elias Cobb, one of the remaining hunters, shook his head. No, he muttered. That thing's dead. We saw it burn. Nathaniel stared at the fire. Did we? He asked. No one had an answer, because deep down they all felt it too. The town was too quiet. The nights were too still, like something was waiting, watching, choosing the right moment to return. The next morning, Nathaniel packed his rifle. Silas stood beside him, doing the same. You really think it's out there? Silas asked. Nathaniel didn't answer, because it didn't matter what he thought. It only mattered what he knew, and he knew this. Legends don't just die, they fade, they wait, and then, when the world forgets them, they return. Nathaniel slung his musket over his shoulder. Then, without another word, he stepped back into the woods, back into the dark, back into the unknown. Because if Shadowfang was still out there, then this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning.